Good evening. I'm Jim Duff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society. It's my honor to welcome you this evening to our virtual program for our latest lecture. The Society was founded in 1974 by then Chief Justice Warren E. Burger to improve public understanding about the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and the judiciary. One of the ways the Society fulfills our mission is with these lectures on the court's history and its justices. At the start of the pandemic, we began using Zoom to reach our audiences, and we plan to continue these virtual lectures even when we can return to in-person programming at the court, because we're reaching broader audiences. So we look forward to returning to the court one of these days, but in the meantime, we're happy for this format. If you've missed an earlier program, please visit the Society's YouTube page to watch them. We think you'll enjoy them. Tonight's speaker is my dear friend, the Honorable Judge Margaret McKeown. Judge McKeown has served almost 25 years as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and affiliated scholar at the Center for the American West at Stanford University, and jurist in residence at the University of San Diego School of Law. As a former White House fellow, she served as special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior. She is a Wyoming native, and she serves on the board of Teton Science Schools. Judge McKeown graduated from Georgetown University Law Center and holds an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University. Before her appointment to the bench, she was the first woman partner at Perkins Coie in Seattle and in Washington, D.C. Judge McKeown is a member of the U.S. Judicial Conference Committee on Judicial Conduct and Disability. We've worked together many years on many different projects for the Judicial Conference and the judiciary, and she is one of my dearest friends. She chairs the Ninth Circuit Workplace Environment Committee, and she's a member of the National Workplace Conduct Working Group appointed by Chief Justice Roberts. She's on the Council for the American Law Institute, the Judicial Advisory Board of the American Society of International Law, and the editorial board of Litigation Magazine. She served as chair of the ABA Commission on the 19th Amendment. She's a past president of the Federal Judges Association and a former chair of the U.S. Judicial Codes Judicial Conference Codes of Conduct Committee. I could keep going with her awards, but I don't want to take any more precious time. She obviously is quite accomplished. I don't know where she's like Justice Douglas. I don't know where she finds time to do all of these things. She's here tonight as the author of Citizen Justice, the Environmental Legacy of William O. Douglas, Public Advocate and Conservation Champion. Published just late this last year, it's a thoroughly researched and well-written work, and I'm delighted she's here with us this evening to share her insights that she garnered from writing this important work. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with the Supreme Court Historical Society, but particularly with you, Jim. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'd like to begin with your background and interest in writing the book. Those who grow up near the wilderness or have had exposure to it cannot help but be awed by it and appreciate it and wants to preserve it. You clearly have that experience. It shines through in your work in this book. And although the focus of your work is clearly that on Justice Douglas, your own love for the environment is reflected. If you could, we could start by you describing your own experiences growing up and throughout your career and what led you to write this work.
Sure. Well, I am a Westerner at heart. I grew up in Wyoming and spent a lot of my time outdoors. And when I went to Georgetown Law School, what I really missed were the mountains. But I also, having grown up landlocked, decided to go to Seattle because then I would have mountains and water. And during all this time, I was a hiker and also a mountain climber. I was on the first American expedition to a mountain in Tibet called Mount Shishibangma. That's 26,000 plus feet. I did not make it to the top. I was unfortunately in a big avalanche, but I survived. But, you know, all of that has given me some sense of appreciation. And anyone who's been out west or lived west knows there is such a vast swath of public land. And there's often, particularly in Wyoming, way more land than people. And so you really have to have an appreciation of nature and the land. So what prompted me really was kind of serendipitous. I was out snowshoeing in Grand Teton National Park, and I came across this homestead that I hadn't seen before. So I was standing on top of a roof covered with snow, wondering, where am I? And a gentleman came out, and I said to him, where am I? I mean, I knew where I was. I knew where the river was. I knew how to get back. And he said, oh, well, you were at the Murie Center. And so, all knowing, I said, of course, I know John Muir. And he said, no, Murie, M-U-R-I-E. So I admitted my ignorance and learned that Olaus Murie had been the president of the Wilderness Society, and that this homestead had been what they called conservation's home. And at one point, Douglas had written to the Muries. He came to know them through various excursions, expeditions, and protest hikes. He had written to them and said, why don't you turn this homestead over to the Park Service and have it be a sanctuary for nature? And I thought, well, that's a little presumptuous. A Supreme Court justice telling these people like to deed their homestead to the national park. So I did a little more investigation, and it really started as a lark. And it turned into this book after many visits to the Library of Congress, where Douglas has his papers. He was a total pack rat. So everything is there, from his calendars to his drafts, to thousands of photos, to little books that he wrote in. And I really got inspired and wanted to know more. And as I began further, I realized there was a larger story to tell than Douglas and the Muries. And the larger story was really what Justice Douglas did in terms of what I call being a one-man lobby shop for the environment. Now, in terms of having time to do all this, well, anytime I came to DC for a committee meeting, I then spent Saturday in the Library of Congress. And I spent a number of years researching, and my research was finished when tragically COVID hit. But locked in my house and working by day for the court, I was then writing my book by night. And it was perfect because I couldn't go anywhere. They had even closed the national forest, so I couldn't even go hiking in those early weeks and months. So that's how the book came to be.
Wow, it's so thoroughly researched. I wondered how long it must have taken you to write this. But so you started a few years ago with the research.
Right. The research took about 4 years off and on all over the country. And with a lot, what I also enjoyed were the interviews with virtually every living clerk of Justice Douglas, with Kathy Douglas, his fourth wife and last wife, and very helpful. In her own right, she was a very accomplished environmental lawyer and philanthropist. So I really enjoyed meeting all these people, some in person and some virtually.
Well, Justice Douglas clearly recognized the power of the wilderness and the outdoors, the awe it can inspire in people. And I think your book does a wonderful job of demonstrating how he harnessed that power of the environment and its impact it can have on people. Can you give us a general idea of examples of how he did so? And we'll get into more specifics later, but he utilized it to mobilize people.
Sure. Well, I think I'll start back with his first term on the court. He was the second youngest justice ever appointed, and he is the longest serving justice even now, 36 years 1939 to 1975. But in his first term on the court, there was a case called Woodruff versus O'Malley, and I have a slide here to show you what he said about that. The case was fairly straightforward. The question is, do federal judges have to pay income tax? And the court made short work of that question, said, well, of course they do. Douglas always kept these little diaries and notes. So he said that he wrote into his diary, I just made myself a first-class citizen. And he basically said, I can do what anybody else can do as long as it doesn't interfere with the court. So that's where I derived my title, Citizen Justice. And of course, the conundrum is, did it in fact interfere with the work of the court? He was a prodigious worker and said it only took him 3 to 4 days a week to do the court's work. So you can imagine that did not endear him to his colleagues. But he really had, he was, many people said, one of the few geniuses they had ever met. So he had an incredible intellect. He wrote fast, sometimes too fast. Sometimes I've heard his opinions called airplane specials, meaning he wrote them on the plane between Washington and his cabin out in Washington State. But he really was inspired by the wilderness. He had polio as a child, and that, while disputed, it's no doubt he was sickly. So he tried to overcome that by going out into the woods. And he created this incredible bond, a kind of almost spirituality between himself and nature and the wilderness. So he was really inspired in that way. And after about a decade on the court, frankly, I think he was a little bored. And his first marriage was falling apart. I hope we'll get into what he was doing politically, but politics didn't seem to be in the cards anymore. So that's when I think he was really spurred to go where his passion was, and that was for nature.
Well, you mentioned politics, Judge McKeown, and let's go there for a little bit. I enjoyed very much how you framed this book, and it's not particularly focused on his jurisprudence, although you certainly touch on it with some discussion of his environmental cases he's most known for. But it focuses so much on his work off the bench and his passion for environmental protections. Let's talk a bit about his flirtations or interests in political office. And they occurred, I wouldn't say throughout his tenure on the court. At some point, he sort of gave up on the notion, but he had presidential aspirations. And I'll let you describe and the others.
Sure. You know, he was a restless person. And he had been, interesting thing is when he graduated from Columbia, he didn't get a Supreme Court clerkship. But remarkably, just 14 years later, he was on the US Supreme Court, which is pretty remarkable. And so, you know, he had been kind of bullied as a kid, but all of a sudden he had a fair amount of sense of himself. And he loved the hobnobbing in Washington, D.C. He'd come down to do some studies on bankruptcy and business reorganization. And before long, under Joe Kennedy's tutelage, he became chair of the SEC, and then went from there on to the court. So in those early years, in the 40s, when Roosevelt was looking for a vice president, Douglas was definitely interested. Truman was interested. There were several others. And the question is, who would the president choose? He had a very close relationship with Douglas, with whom he played poker way into the night, almost like a father figure. And there was a little piece of paper, which nobody has actually seen, that said Truman Douglas or Douglas Truman at the Democratic National Convention. Douglas said he wasn't interested, but I have to ask you, why did he arrange for a phone hookup from one of his cabins in Oregon to the post office, just in case somebody called? Well, we know the answer. The president chose Truman as his vice president. And then time went on, and sadly, President Roosevelt died. Truman becomes president, and he then asks Douglas if he would be the vice president. Douglas turned it down. He said, why be number 2 to a number 2? So it gives you some sense. His name was still bandied about into the 50s as a possible candidate. And even way into the time of Johnson, he harbored some sense that maybe he would be vice president. And at one point, he'd even thought he'd be a good Secretary of State. And although they offered him Secretary of Interior at one point, which was really in his wheelhouse of public lands, he chose not to do that. So he toyed with politics, and there were others too, advising Roosevelt, going on commissions. So the justices were more integrated into political life, during that period, particularly during the war period. So Douglas, had a real sense of things, and he knew where the political levers were. So I dug up a couple of pictures of him with presidents, and you can see that here, where he's with, in this photo, he's with President Kennedy and President Johnson. Now, Kennedy wasn't president long enough to have a big impact on the environment, but Kennedy asked him to take Bobby to Russia, do some mountain climbing, and he tried to invoke Kennedy's assistance on various environmental matters. He said, the trouble with you, Jack, is you never slept on the ground. So obviously the Bluebud Kennedys were not quite the same as Douglas, who camped and hiked and went mountain climbing. You also see him here with Johnson, very close. Johnson signed the Wilderness Act in 1964 and a number of other environmental bills. But Douglas always felt that Johnson wasn't quite a true environmentalist, although he really enjoyed Lady Bird. One of the books he wrote was called Farewell to Texas, because he thought Texas was basically going to hell in a handbasket because of developers and degradation of the environment. And the Johnsons, particularly Lady Bird, tried to get him to change the title, which he didn't. But he did have quite a close relationship, with Johnson and with the Washington senators, Senators Jackson and Magnuson. They were called the Twin Towers of Power, or the senators from Boeing out in Washington State. So if he wasn't talking to the president, he was down on the hill talking to people about some of his favorite environmental issues. And he also knew that all politics is local. So he tried to form citizen committees at the local level to work on whatever project he had. And he also, he had a pretty sharp tongue. So if he didn't like a local forest person or someone, he'd really go after them, actually.
At the same time, he was being so active off the bench, he was expressing his commitment to the court. You quote him as saying, "Politics is perishable, the work of the court is long and enduring." So he certainly had an interest and love for the court and its work, yet he managed to keep a foot in both branches, and it's mainly executive, not legislative, that he had an interest in. How do you think he managed both? Was it his intellectual capacity, work ethic? How would you? I don't know anyone else who was. You mentioned that there were others sort of justices at the time involved somewhat politically, perhaps more so than these days, but Douglas did still stand out a bit, I think, from even others at the time.
Well, he did, and you kind of captured it. It was his intellect and his incredible work ethic, this notion that he will stay on the court because the court is enduring, politics are transitory. He spouted that quite a bit. And he also said the court was a monastery. That sentiment was echoed by other justices, including Frankfurter, but I would say, wow, that is quite some monastery that you guys are living in. It's not, Frankfurter was out there basically campaigning for Zionism. Douglas is out there campaigning, whether it was for the Sierra Club or Wilderness or whatever. So how did he do it? Well, he really worked all these hikes in that he did. And some hikes were, pleasure hikes, and some were protest hikes. But he's an incredible correspondent. So no matter who wrote to him, for example, someone he's never met in Ohio and says, I'm worried about pesticides, he would write back and he would tell them who to get in touch with. And, this was the time of Rachel Carson. So he was ahead of his time in thinking about these things, but he was just busy. And I think one of the things that would surprise his colleagues, and I think even surprised his law clerks, was how much he was doing outside the court parallel to his court work. I'm not sure that he ever slept, actually.
You're it is amazing how much he accomplished. Your book provides an excellent history too, Margaret, of the development of environmental work in the United States. I found it fascinating to watch how it emerged, and you trace it throughout our history. You differentiate between conservation and preservation and environmental work generally. Can you explain and describe those differences and where Justice Douglas's work best fits?
Well, much of the early work in the United States might be described as preservationist. For example, Thoreau and John Muir. And that was a sense that you needed to save everything and that human incursion was a negative factor. The conservationists envision more what I'd call multiple uses. So when he was a kid, Douglas really loved Gifford Pinchot, or the idea of Gifford Pinchot. And Pinchot, of course, was our first forester in the United States, US forester. Douglas said, I want to grow up and be like Gifford Pinchot. But later he said, oh, the problem with Pinchot is all he wants to do is cut things down, cut. And it's true, the Forest Service had a multiple use policy. So the notion of preservation, where you preserve one area or one species, was contrasted later with this broader sense. And many times people use the terms interchangeably. And then eventually the term environmental comes into our lexicon. Wasn't used in the Supreme Court till the 1970s. And you can imagine who was the first justice to use it. It was Justice Douglas. And he was there really as a band leader. They called it the conservation movement, but in many respects, he was more of a preservationist as time went on. He had kind of two abiding themes, and you see this in his personal life and also on the court. One theme was that the wilderness is a vanishing entity, and if you don't preserve it, it will be gone. And then his second principle was that the Constitution was intended to get the government off the backs of little people. So you see both of those themes really throughout his life. And I think that, he combined elements of both preservation and conservation.
Let's talk about his major accomplishments there. We can start with the C&O Canal. There are many to choose from, and you address them well in your book, but that's probably the easiest place to start is the C&O Canal.
Well, it's a good place to start because the C&O Canal was just kind of down the street, if you will, from Justice Douglas. It starts in Georgetown, goes 189 miles, and some years later, he lived very close to the canal. So at one point in the 50s, the Park Service wanted to put a highway into the canal so more people could get there and there would be better access. Douglas read this. He was outraged. So as a justice, he writes to the Washington Post and he said, you're wrong. This is a sanctuary. It needs friends. I invite you to come with me on a hike. And the Post editors agreed to come. So they went on this hike, 189 miles. Post editors didn't make it the whole way, of course. But there he met Olaus Murie, who I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And they formed a fast friendship. over many, many years. Olaus was a scientist as well as someone who was the head of the Wilderness Society. Anyway, he goes on this hike and they come back. They're met. You'll see here a picture of him on the hike. And he's met there by Secretary of Interior. He wants to get maximum publicity. Then he goes out and he starts lobbying the Park Service. And he kind of follows a pattern. Then he forms a committee. Of course, he's the chair of the committee. And over time, and it took a lot of time, into the 70s, they finally named this, the C&O Canal was a National Historic Park with Douglas's name in it. So the Park Service says it's the only park that was walked into existence. And you now today, if where the path starts in Georgetown, you can see a big bust of Douglas dedicated to him for his work. But I would say this was like a catalyst. He had all these ideas ruminating. He had his kind of boredom with the court, realizing he's not going to be president or probably vice president. So now, probably in the mid-50s is when he truly embarks as being a spokesperson, a spokesman for the conservation movement. I kind of say he was like a band leader, and who could better lead your band than someone as prestigious and energetic as William O. Douglas?
Well, it's a great example too of what we talked about earlier and his ability to harness the power and beauty of the outdoors to sell itself. Basically,
Right.
It was an example. He persuaded the Washington Post editors on the walk, and I'm not so sure as so much his own persuasion as the natural beauty itself, but the Post editors changed their view.
I think that's kind of something he specialized in, which is come and see for yourself.
Yeah, it was very, very effective. Let's talk about Alaska and describe your own involvement with the Alaska lands legislation as your work as a White House fellow, and how that intersected with what he was working on at the time too.
Well, he met the Muries, and they weren't really celebrity collectors, but they were going on a big scientific expedition to Alaska. So they invited Douglas to come because they thought, well, it can't hurt. He might be able to use some of his power. So they go on an expedition to the Arctic. And he's very active collecting specimens. Marty Murie, Olaus's wife, was very friendly with him. Justice Douglas, do you want hot chocolate? Justice Douglas, he'd say, no, call me Bill. So while he could be somewhat irascible and difficult with his clerks, with his colleagues, it was like he was a different person out on the trail. So they leave that expedition, and he went on only part of it. And the Muries were like missionaries all over Alaska about why the Arctic needed to be saved. Douglas goes back to Washington, does a little behind the scenes persuasion, and then he writes a whole chapter on Alaska in one of his books called The Pacific Northwest. So eventually Eisenhower did put parts of Alaska into protected status. And that went on for quite a while, and then it was in jeopardy. So President Carter also had put it into protected status. And that was in the late 70s. And around that time, I arrived as a White House fellow for Secretary of Interior Cecil Andrus. And he said to me, you need to look at implementing the Alaska lands legislation. And I said, Mr. Secretary, it's not even passed. And he said, it will be. And interestingly, he felt, as did the president, that you really needed to put all of this into legislation and not have kind of continuing executive orders. So even after President Carter lost, in a rump session, Andrus was able to negotiate the Alaska lands legislation. And he had told me at that time, he said, I think President Carter will lose and no one in the cabinet will admit this. But he says, that's what I feel. And I think we need to do something about this. So I was kind of had a front row seat to watch how he did that and how important it was that he was somebody that brought people together. And the Muries were people who brought people together. So they kind of shared that, and that protected and changed the landscape in Alaska in terms of the millions of acres. But they were also looking at competing rights, the native claims, also looking at timber, fish, wildlife interests. So Andrews was looking at the whole picture. And it was very, for me, it was fascinating as a young lawyer.
Great experience. Let's turn next to the Red River Gorge. That we have, my family has a farm about 10 miles from Red River Gorge in Kentucky. And so that one was near and dear to my heart. And I remember when I was a student at the University of Kentucky, we were working hard there to preserve it from the Army Corps of Engineers plans to dam up the gorge and make a big lake out of the area. Thank goodness, Justice Douglas came riding to the rescue, or lent his name and in that effort. If you could describe that a bit, that's another
Sure.
example.
Well, Douglas published what he called his enemies list. And number one on his enemies list is the Army Corps of Engineers, which you just mentioned, which of course was created in part so there could be flood control, they could create dams, there would be hydropower. And on this issue, he and Roosevelt clashed, of course. So public enemy number one, according to Douglas, and he published a whole article in, if you can imagine, Playboy magazine about this, was the Army Corps, and they planned to do a big dam here on the gorge. So the Sierra Club kept writing to Douglas, asking him if he'd come down. And again, you see all this correspondence, and then he and Kathy Douglas did come down in 1967, and there was a protest hike, a protest gathering. And as soon as Douglas left town, one of the newspapers said they didn't want some senile justice telling people in Kentucky what they should do. Well, while they were writing this, Douglas was on the airplane back to Washington, and he's writing a note to President Johnson. Dear Lyndon, here's what you should do. You should probably do a study. And as we all know, federal studies are a sure way to either kill or delay things. You should do a study in this incredible area. And then he's also writing to his very good friend, the Secretary of Interior. And ultimately, as we know, that dam was never built. So it was another kind of tangible example of a landscape changed by Justice Douglas. But again, he's doing this through his connections with the president, through talking to people on Capitol Hill, and through his time talking to the Secretary of Interior.
Well, it was, thank goodness, it's been preserved. We still enjoy the natural beauty there. We want to take questions from the audience before we get to that though. I do want to cover a couple other topics, and if the audience could submit their questions in writing, we'll read those to Judge McKeown. But I would like to talk about his extrajudicial work, even beyond what you've described so far. He wrote over 50 books. Can you give us a sense of the breadth of the topics and how he managed to do that?
Well, again, he wrote what was the equivalent of about a book a year, which is, stunning to me. And he had literally scores of articles. Of course, back then, magazines actually paid you for articles. So he wrote for Playboy because he said that's what young men like to read, but he wrote for Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, National Geographic, the National Enquirer. So he wrote for all kinds of publications. But on his books, they really ranged. There were a lot of travel. He traveled extensively in the Mideast, Russia, India. So there were books like Strangers in a Strange Land or Beyond the High Himalayas. So, for example, if you see that movie Rear Window and Grace Kelly is there at the end, she's reading a book, and you look carefully, that book is Beyond the High Himalayas by Justice Douglas. So he had all these books he was writing. He wrote a trilogy of autobiography for himself, wrote books like the Wilderness Bill of Rights, fashioned after the Constitution's Bill of Rights, wrote books like Farewell to Texas. So he also wrote many of his projects, whether it was saving a beach on the Washington coast or something in Arkansas or up in Maine. He would write quite an extensive chapter in books on that. So it was really a remarkable set of writings that he had in addition to his court writings. And, you know, plowing through all those isn't easy. Sometimes he was repetitive, to say the least, but he was often very flowery when he would talk about nature. It was very almost spiritual for him to talk about nature. At one point, the justices or administrators had this idea that maybe you should have your writings approved in advance. Well, he was a big proponent on the First Amendment, so that set him into a jet stream of controversy about that. And he said, no. And then they said, well, maybe at least you should, have your writings in terms of money and revenue from writings, that should be disclosed. And he said almost presciently, well, how about stocks? Why don't judges have to report their stocks? Which of course later it did happen that justices and judges report not only earnings, for example, on writings, but on stocks. So on the first financial report, he filled it out, but kind of with a "I protest" asterisk at the bottom. That was his nature.
Let's talk a little bit about the court and his work on it. You focused so much about his work off the court, of course, in the book, but you did mention that he is the longest serving justice in history, over 36 years. What were his relationships like with other justices? And I thought you did a superb job in the work contrasting his loner approach on the court with his consensus building and environmental work. It's an interesting contrast. Can you elaborate on that a bit for us?
He said, with respect to the court, the only soul I have to save is my own. So that might explain that, he had nearly 500 dissents, and in 40% of those, he was the lone dissenter. So he wasn't always seeking consensus. And you can see that. Now, he had a number of very famous majority opinions. Griswold v. Connecticut, a 7-2 majority opinion on privacy, and others, but he wasn't someone who was going to kind of cajole people into going his way. And on the other hand, that was what he was doing with environmentalists, trying to bring people together, get them energized behind a common issue, and then, go from there. So it was quite a contrast. And I think one of the things you think about and learn from Douglas is you look at both the positive and negatives of being a contrarian, of somebody who's always a dissenter. So it has some advantages. It has, looking to the future is how he would say his dissents were, but it also has, downsides. And, in contrast, let's say to Frankfurter, with whom he had a very contentious relationship, Frankfurter had kind of a vision of himself, meaning Frankfurter as a leader on the court. I don't think Douglas came onto the court like that. And so he never achieved that. And of course, Frankfurter didn't either. I mean, they were very similar in their backgrounds and professors, and then come to the court. But, Frankfurter was kind of what he thought was a realist, and Douglas, was an activist in Frankfurter's view. So both personality-wise and judicial philosophy, they were at loggerheads.
I have a very interesting anecdote I wanted to share with you, Margaret. We haven't talked about it before, but as you know, I worked as counselor to Chief Justice Rehnquist from 1996 to 2000. And during those years, there was he received a letter from a professor at Princeton, he being Chief Justice Rehnquist, who was a mutual friend of Justice Douglas's and Chief Justice Rehnquist. And when Rehnquist was a justice, before he became Chief Justice, he was known as the Lone Ranger because he was often the only one in dissent. But the letter from this professor to Chief Justice Rehnquist talks about his friendship with Justice Douglas. And he mentions that Bill Douglas once said to him that the brightest, most intelligent justice he ever worked with in his tenure on the court was Bill Rehnquist. And it was an interesting observation for me, although he went on to say he decides the wrong way most of the time, but he was the brightest. They had similar intellects, I think, and I wanted to share that anecdote with you.
Yeah, well, it's a great anecdote. And, he was not somebody who minded that people disagreed with him. Other people might have a thinner skin on that topic, but not Douglas. So I could see where, he was somebody who recognized talent.
No.
Yeah, definitely.
He's probably best known for his dissent in Sierra Club versus Morton. And should trees have standing? Would you like to talk a little bit about that decision?
Sure. Well, 50 years ago, the Sierra Club had challenged Walt Disney's effort to build a ski resort in a place called Mineral King in the Sierra Mountains in California. And the Sierra Club kind of rolled the dice on standing. Basically, instead of saying a member of the club would be damaged, they said that really the environment itself would be damaged. So they won an injunction in the district court. The Ninth Circuit overturned that, went then to the Supreme Court. And Douglas, who had very close relations with the Sierra Club, there was some debate, would he recuse? And he chose not to recuse. So he wrote a very stirring dissent, basically saying that you shouldn't still the voice of rivers, valleys, and mountains, even though they're inanimate objects. And I think he knew he was writing for the future. It's called The Rights of Nature, hasn't caught on in the US, but has caught on with a lot of municipalities and in foreign countries that an inanimate object, whether we know ships can sue, corporations can sue, he said, why not nature? And part of that, had come out of some early works of a professor at USC. And interestingly, that article from the USC professor was kind of bootlegged to Justice Douglas during the time of Sierra Club v. Morton. So when I, at the Library of Congress, was able to put together all the correspondence from USC, I could see that he was receiving ex parte from a professor this article with these theories. Now, he'd espoused those theories before, but it's certainly, I think, his most stirring dissent. And last year was the 50th anniversary of that dissent. So it really stands, I think, in the annals of Supreme Court jurisprudence as, one of the most stirring dissents.
Well, there's absolute fascination with your work in your book and this presentation. That we have a series of questions from the audience. I want to get to those. I want to offer you the opportunity to, as you conclude, to describe Justice Douglas's legacy. So let's go to the questions first, but we'll come back. We'll come back and conclude with your observations about his legacy. The question is, this is a fascinating discussion. Did your research change the way in which you've kept your own records as a judge?
And that's a very interesting question because, I started as a paper judge and then transitioned to be an electronic judge and virtually all of our correspondence. And it's raised a lot of questions for historians, like how will things be preserved? I don't have any illusion that anyone really wants to look at my paper like they do Justice Douglas or various others, but it does make you really think. I've thought about the other, like the justices, as many of them have transitioned, and there's just nothing richer for a researcher than to go and look at Justice Marshall's papers, to look at Rehnquist's papers, and to look at these others. So it's made me think about that topic generally, and I work with our court archivist to think about that. And we've also worked with some professors, one at the University of Virginia, to help us, think about keeping records, because we know that even saying that it's retained digitally does not necessarily mean that over time that those media will be able to be preserved and accessed. So it raises a lot of interesting questions. And I have to say, Douglas used to have these little books, and he would write in them prodigiously. Every hike, every major hike, there was a book. Who was on the hike? What did he see? What specimens did he collect? What did he think, when he wrote that little note about, now I'm a citizen like everybody else. So, I was the beneficiary of this guy being a pack rat and saving everything, and also being an incredible correspondent. I'm not sure anyone else is like such a correspondent, but he, Justice Douglas was an unusual person. But there are many other archives from justices, that are equally interesting. And I just hope that 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, that Supreme Court Historical Society will also, be able to benefit from some of these archives.
Well, and as someone who works here now, we encourage you to save all your records too. You mentioned mountain climbing in Russia. Did Justice Douglas have views on U.S.-Russia relations?
Yeah, he did. I mean, it was interesting. He went to China, which at the time was called Red China. And one time he came back from there, and he had a press conference in San Francisco and said the United States should have relations with Red China. Well, the president and the Secretary of State came down on him and said, "You are not the Secretary of State." You have to realize that in some of those early years, Russia was still our ally. So he was going to Russia at a time, like when he took Bobby Kennedy, when they were, a post-war ally. But his general views about Russia, China, Persia, Iran, and Persia as it was called, and he called it, is that the United States should be more open to these governments. And he would say that publicly. He was very involved in some of these issues in Persia when the Shah took over, and there was tension, political tension there. So I would say no country and no government was beyond an opinion by Justice Douglas.
Let's go back to your description of we're running a little bit short of time here when we have a lot
Sure.
of questions, but I do want to give you the opportunity to describe how his legacy in your view.
Sure. Well, I think his legacy is mixed, and I came to realize I didn't start into it with any proposition, but I came to realize that heroes are imperfect, and Justice Douglas is an imperfect hero. I can show you here. I think I have one last slide with some photos, and you'll be able to see here his cabin in Goose Prairie, Washington. We can show that.
Yeah.
And he's a lot of times he would leave the Supreme Court before everything was done on June 30. He would just jump on the plane, fly out to Washington to this cabin at Goose Prairie.
Mm-hmm.
And,
pulling it up. Pulling it up.
Great. He would just say, "Well, I'm done with my dissent. I'm done with my majority opinions, and here I go." So you see, there's the cabin. There's his wife, Kathy Douglas. There's a couple of people he protested with. But during this time, he tried to preserve a wilderness very near his house in the Cascades. You're looking up at Mount Rainier. And after he died, although he worked closely with the two Democratic senators from Washington, it was two Republican senators that really brought it home. And they paid tribute to him and basically said that he had done so much for the environment that there now is the William O. Douglas Wilderness in that area. So, he's an interesting guy. He had a personality of, he could be as nice as pie and he could be difficult. He was difficult with his law clerks. And yet he was also, he would tell them, get into the stream of history and swim as fast as you can. He was also like in my view, a kind of a canary in the coal mine. He warned against pollution. He warned against pesticides. He warned against damage to the fish. He was in favor of native rights. And interestingly, he was critical of the administrative state. He'd been in it. So in kind of what goes around comes around of, jurisprudence, he was somebody who thought there should be less deference to administrative agencies. And that's, of course, a proposition that you see now is very au courant. So Douglas was both ahead and behind from his times, in that regard. And the legacy he left us, I would say, is that there are rivers preserved, there are trees standing, there are mountains preserved. Very physical landscape of America was changed because of Justice Douglas. So that's a legacy that lived up to what he said. He said, I'd like to be remembered as somebody who made the land more beautiful than when I came. And I think he did.
Thank you. I agree. And you mentioned he was irascible. I was fortunate enough to work at the Supreme Court in his last years there. I worked in Chief Justice Berger's chambers. And in 1975, he gave me a tie for Christmas. And I saved it.
That's
and
great.
I was going to wear it tonight, but it's about the size of a beach towel. So I could, in the mid 70s, that was the style.
He was like that. He liked to give out gifts. Somebody was sick, he'd send him a case of Jack Daniels. I mean, I'm not that sure what you could get that in the hospital, but he could be incredibly nice. And like the Muries, he'd say, here's $1.25. I used your telephone to make a long distance call. So he had this incredibly gentle, sweet, and gifty, side to himself that you obviously were the beneficiary of.
Well, I saved it. I treasured it, but I would have worn it, but I couldn't get it on.
Well, maybe we can go on a hike in the C&O Canal and you can wear it.
That's a deal. Well, this has been wonderful, and we're very grateful that you've taken the time to be with us tonight, Margaret, and it was a very illuminating conversation. I'm going to not hold up his tie, but hold up your book. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't purchased it yet, I encourage you to do so. Citizen Justice by Judge McKeown. We have signed copies of it. This is a signed copy that I will treasure to me. And we have signed copies of it available in the Society's gift shop at www.supremecourtgifts.org. And we hope you purchase it. We host monthly virtual lectures on the history of the court, and our next one will be held on February 15th at 7 p.m. when BYU Professor Bradley Ribeiro will be sharing his new research on Frederick Douglass's constitutionalism. Registration is open and available at the Society website, www.supremecourthistory.org. And a reminder, a survey will go out tomorrow morning to everyone who registered for this lecture in advance. We encourage you to respond. We do want to make these programs as interesting and accessible to as many people as possible. Once again, I want to thank our guest, Judge Margaret McKeown, for joining us tonight, and a fascinating lecture and a well-researched and written book about the longest serving justice in our history, William O. Douglas.
Thank you
Margaret,
for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you. And with that, thank you all for joining us. We are adjourned.